This week, we dive deep into the security news and cover compliance, localization, and blah, blah, blah. The greatest cybersecurity myth ever told, trolling Microsoft with a video, GitHub actions give birth to a supply chain attack, prioritizing security research. I'm tired of 0 days that aren't really 0 days. Sticking your head in the sand and believing everything is fine. I'm excited about AI crawlers, but some are not. Room 641A, a real ESP32 vulnerability. Do we need a CVE for every default credential? Smart Flipper Zero add-ons. One reason why people fear firmware updates. No more Windows 10. You should just use Linux. And I have a Linux terminal in my pocket. Now what? All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Paul's Security Weekly is supported by Bitwarden, the trusted solution for password, passkey, and secrets management. Bitwarden empowers everyone to create and manage strong and unique credentials across all accounts and devices. With enterprise SSO integration, end-to-end encryption, and secure autofill capabilities, Bitwarden defends against phishing attacks and data breaches. Strengthen your security posture with tools built to protect what matters most. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Bitwarden. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 866, being recorded on Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by Mr. Josh Marpet. Josh, welcome.
Why, thank you. It is always a pleasure to be here, even when I'm running in the door to get in here on time.
No, it's all good, dude. Glad to have you here. Mr. Jeff Mann is also here with us. Jeff, welcome.
Back in the home office studio with all the right cameras and lighting and microphones, and the mute button is not pressed.
That's right. That's right. There's so many mute buttons. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us.
Good evening. Glad to be here.
Yes, nice to have you. Quick announcement before we get started for those of you that may be considering going to the RSA conference this year. If you're a Security Weekly listener, you can save $100 on the RSAC conference 2025. It's a full conference pass. RSA conference will take place April 28th through May 1st in San Francisco and on demand. To register using the discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC25. Use the discount code 5U5SECWeekly. Hope to see you there. I won't be there, but many of us will. You should do that. A lot of fun. Now for the Security Weekly news. I would just start at the top and we can talk about Jeff's compliance story. Because Jeff, I know you're itching to talk about compliance. It's fine.
I'm not itching to talk about compliance.
I know, but I don't know. I have thoughts of this. Like when I read the story, because this comes from Fortra's Tripwire, right? Because Fortra purchased a lot of companies, right? They're like the new CA. Remember, like CA back in the day, or Cisco? Both was making like a lot of acquisitions.
Right.
Fortra scooped up a whole bunch of companies, including Core Security, including Raphael Mudge's company, Cobalt Strike, and they bought Tripwire. And I feel like Tripwire used to make really awesome posts, and now they're very like business, almost AI generated, just kind of spewing stuff.
Maybe that's
right
the
now.
problem with this article, because it was like almost a good read, but it just seemed to be very circular in its logic.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like someone used AI to generate it, but made modifications, but not enough to make it
right
real enough for me, right?
Right.
But they were talking about the localization and compliance, right? Like where I'm a company, I'm based somewhere, but I do business in the United States with different states, or I do business internationally, and compliance impacts me in different ways. I didn't see a great solution around that. And you kind of called bunk on a lot of it, Jeff.
Kind of. Well, You know me in trying to make sure that we define our terminology. They just assume that everybody knows what localization is about, and maybe everybody does. But I think it's always nice to assume that people don't, and just start with a basic what is localization, because I went off and had to Google it
Yeah.
just to make sure I knew what they were talking about. So yeah, it's the idea on a grand scale, like when GDPR came about, everybody in the EU is trying to figure out how to keep all their data within the borders. Essentially, they talk about region, but I think in most cases it's nation state borders that most people are worrying about. But they seem to say that they seem to be implying that there was a way to use localization to as something to help with compliance being meeting some sort of security threshold or security baseline. But they then seem to say that you need to have localization just to meet the requirements that are being put on you by things like GDPR in the first place. And I just never could derive from the article what they were getting at in terms of a value add other than meeting the requirements that they already have to meet, if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, if you keep the data in one locale, as it were, and that's just like part of the equation, right?
Right.
But it's also very rare that data stays in whatever like region or locale that you're putting it in, right? The whole point of having data is that it travels and other people can access it and see it.
Right.
So,
Well, I know we've done or I've seen reports on compliance rocks where you have to list all your third-party service providers and data centers, sort of not a term we use anymore, hosting facilities, the cloud. Very often they'll be very specific as to which particular data center or hosting facility that they're using. Is it AWS has one on the east and has one on the west or something like that in the US?
yeah, all the cloud providers have a region you can.
And so I get it from that perspective. But yeah, I mean, with all the backups and the idea that information is freely available, with a click of a button everywhere to anybody at any time, I can see how it's hard to enforce. But I also don't see how just meeting those requirements isn't something to leverage or is something to do to make. I think they were implying that compliance is easier if you just simply follow the rules. I don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Captain Obvious called, and
Now, I mean, I don't want to give them too much. I don't want to do their work for them. But the idea that we're almost talking about is, if you A, know where your data is, and B, you have it in as few locations as possible, then in theory, it's easier to put boundaries about it and control access or keep track of who's accessing it, that type of thing. So maybe that's what they were getting at, but they sure didn't say it.
it's weird.
Yep.
The next one's more of this is like a great Bugcrowd has the best marketing.
I love that website.
Dude, their marketing is just, I've told Casey this too. I'm like, dude, your marketing department is like on point. Like
Yep.
you can give them that feedback too, because I don't often say that about marketing and cybersecurity, but they are on point. And they built this landing page.
Yeah,
And the headline is "Unmask the Greatest Cybersecurity Myth Ever Told." I mean, right there, I'm engaged, right? Like I want to know, like I just want to know, like that's great marketing right there. Like someone has a degree in psychology or just gets it, one or more, or both. And they created this like fictitious town called Gapsville, and Stan Breacherton is the mayor, and they've got all this like really rich, well done media that surrounds it, and it's all about the skills gap, right? That's why it's called Gapsville. They've got, I didn't listen to a lot of them, but they've got like music, and it's just in video. It's really, really well done. It is visually appealing. It's witty. It's just great. So I like to call out great cybersecurity marketing when I see it, and I think this is great.
I met his marketing person last year at RSA, and of course I'm blanking on her name right now. But funny story, last year at RSA, Casey's always been a supporter of TongaCon, which was the informal gathering that used to happen on Sunday nights in the Tonga room before the whole week of craziness started. And I'd also gotten in touch with Alan Schimmel about the security bloggers meetup. And last year he was like, "Oh, I'm having trouble finding a place," and I'm like, "Well, why don't you try the Tonga room?" So we ended up at the Tonga room, and I had told Casey about it. Of course, he was co-sponsoring this, TongaCon / security bloggers meetup. So I'm there, and this woman walks up to me and says, "Hi, Casey says I should meet you and we should exchange information." And I was like, if the shoes were turned around and I was approaching some strange person that's female and I'm a guy, I'd probably get thrown out of the place. So I was busting on Casey right away. And he's like, "Oh, sorry about that, dude." But, great people, as you said.
For sure. Let's move to GitHub Actions give birth to a supply chain attack, Sam. I saw this one. Yep. I didn't dig into it very much, but I think it's interesting that we think of GitHub Actions as, I guess it's really like a cloud-based server, SaaS-based service that GitHub provides, right?
Yeah. It's like a browser plugin or WordPress plugin, from what I understand. And the point is, this is a popular one. People add it so they can review the changes made in GitHub. And so somebody managed to steal a token and compromise the project, and add malware. But what the malware does is take your secrets from GitHub and put them in the log. And the log is only public if your whole GitHub is public. So in fact, I think the consequences of this are pretty small. I mean, if you're putting secrets in a public GitHub, I think they're already compromised.
Very true.
So, it's interesting in that they had a stolen personal access token. And this gets us back to something we've talked about many times here. The service accounts that people connect with are not using two-factor, and nobody knows how to make them use two-factor, and they're often the way in. And so this personal account token didn't have two-factor. So once they steal that, they're in.
Yeah, I've not really messed around with GitHub Actions. I would assume you have to give it. Is that what Actions use, a token to gain access to certain aspects of the repository?
Know. I haven't used them either, but I think the point is this didn't directly use the action. They got in the source code for the action. So it's like any other supply chain attack, like SolarWinds or anything else. Right.
Oh, I see. So anyone that used that's what I read. Anyone that used the action was compromised. Right.
And that's the issue. There's 23,000 repositories using this action. But if they're not public, there's very little harm done, I think. So
because they can't get the data out.
Right. So all it does is copy your data to another location that's also not public. So it doesn't send your data to a remote attacker.
Right.
Like you would think.
So it only affected, I wonder how many of those, 23,000 were actually public?
I imagine very few.
Yeah, this might be a stretch, but I wanted to unpack your statement about people using service accounts to gain access. Are they really using service accounts, or are they setting up service accounts in order to transfer or enable this plugin function to get the GitHub data back to wherever they want it?
In this case, it was not a compromise by means of a service account. It was like that.
Okay.
They found a personal access token, which was enough to get in. I guess that means they must not have had. They say the personal access token was linked to a bot account. So it was an automated process, which is the problem.
Okay.
I mean, most people use two-factor for everything important now, but apparently they had some kind of bot that had the ability to upload new code. Perhaps an automated process or something. And this, I think, is the weak spot everywhere. Everybody has these automated processes, and none of them are using two-factor.
Right. But
in fact, how could they?
It's a double-edged sword because, automations in GitHub are pretty awesome for security. I mean, just even built into GitHub, right? Because I've got like repositories kicking around. Some of them might be private, some of them public. But the GitHub would be like, oh, by the way, like you've got a library that's vulnerable in one of those repositories. I'm like, well, that's super positive in a good
Yeah,
security benefit. But
But to find that out, it had to make a connection with an automated process, which was not two-factor. So
yeah,
that's an
right,
exposure.
right. And the same thing happens in Windows, right? In a Windows
Oh,
environment with service
and
accounts.
there's so many service accounts in
Yeah.
domains, fetching email and all that jazz going on, and they are single factor, and people usually never change the password, so they're common a way for an attacker to get in.
Right. I mentioned Raphael Mudge earlier, and I haven't followed like what happened with Cobalt Strike. I didn't know that Raphael actually left. I think I remember that now. And then I saw a thing where he stood up a blog and started writing again.
Yeah.
In his first article, I don't know if you guys read his first article. He calls the blog what does he call it? Adversary Fan Fiction Writers Guild. It's just amazing.
You remember he did the comic books. He's actually very good at fictionalizing those kinds of writing efforts. So like he did comic books about Cobalt Strike as his original user guides, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, and his website is aff-wg.org. And he made a post on March 13th, and he called it The Security Conversation. It covers a lot of ground in this particular post, and touches on a lot of different areas. The gist of the whole thing is basically justifying offensive security research. It sounds like over the course of his career, he's caught some flack for and seen others in our community that are our mutual friends, right, catch flack for pointing out weaknesses, flaws, and exposures, and other people saying, well, you're just trying to poo-poo everything and mess everything up in our industry. And the article, I think, is a kind of a rebuttal to that mindset. And I thought it was interesting. You should read it, right? I mean, that's kind of the gist of it. There's like so much ground to cover in that article. But I kind of ran up against some of this particular mindset recently. Like I caught wind of it. I don't want to give what the context was, but like basically, and I've run into this when I worked in vulnerability management, right? There are folks that work to defend our enterprises that are like, look, I don't want solutions that tell me about more stuff that I have to fix, especially if there's no great fix for it. Like if there's no patch for it and no fix for it, then why are you telling me about it? Because now it's something else I have to deal with, and I don't want to deal with it. I'd rather not know about it. Then I don't have to tell my management, auditors, board of directors, federal compliance regulators, industry regulators, whatever. I don't have to tell them about it if I don't know about it, right? I just wholeheartedly believe that is the wrong approach, and I don't agree with it at all. And there are many that are defending, and I'm probably going to get flack for it, and quite frankly, I don't care, because this is my opinion, is you want to know about everything. I would want to know about everything. If I'm the CISO working in the IT team, I want to know about all of the exposures, all of the vulnerabilities, even if there's no clear-cut solution. That's my opportunity to come up with creative solutions, to come up and document. And Jeff, you're on the compliance side, Josh, you too, right? Like if there is a condition that is found somewhere in my network or in my systems, and I'm like, well, there's no patch for the vendor, EDR doesn't catch it. Now I know about it. Okay, I'm going to document it. And what are my creative solutions? I'm going to increase my monitoring, right? Yep. I'm going to increase, make sure I'm logging it. I'm going to put some detection on the network. I'm going to run down the list of all the things that I can do to increase my visibility into this area, and I'm going to document those. No, is it perfect? No, because I don't have a patch for it, right? So it's still going to be vulnerable, but I'm going to document my knowledge and remediation of this particular issue. I think in most cases, auditors, regulators, whomever, are going to be like, yeah, that's like the best you can do, right? And I personally want to know about it as well, because as we've seen as a trend for the past however many years, attackers go after those like the cracks in the wall, right? The little hairline fractures, right? Maybe that you can't see, maybe only with like an X-ray machine or whatever, you can't see those cracks in the foundation. But that's why attackers are going after it. Deploying enterprise AI, tools like Copilot from Microsoft 365 and Glean are prone to oversharing and data leakage. They lack the in-depth access controls required to ensure that query responses align with users' need to know boundaries. Without proper access controls, these tools accelerate the discovery of improperly secured sensitive files within the organization's M365 environment. Gnostic enables enterprises to safely adopt AI through setting need-to-know based access controls. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Gnostic and see how Gnostic can help stop AI oversharing.
Well, you called it an approach and a wrong approach. I was thinking it's almost more like a mindset or a mentality, and it certainly ties back to, I think it's a large part of the whole compliance versus security debate, where there's a perception from a compliance perspective, as you said, find something, you have to deal with it, you have to document it, you have to come up with fixes, and so on and so forth. It's more work. But I agree with you. It's more important from a security perspective to know about the things, research it, know what an indicator of compromise or an indicator of somebody's trying to poke at that thing, which involves increased monitoring and logging and things like that, and response. But there's a mentality that I see a lot of. It's a combination of, I just want to do the bare minimum, or in the PCI world, the game has become de-scoping everything. And I've always, de-scoping has been a thing for most of the time I've been doing PCI.
Right. But I thought of you when someone described that to me, because I've heard you describe your interactions with your customers.
Right.
And as an auditor, Jeff, if I was the client and you were the auditor, I'd be like, yeah, I had no patch for this, Jeff, but here's the 3 things that we documented that we did and will do on a continuous basis to deal with this new exposure that we don't have a patch for.
Right.
And
we call that a compensating control.
Compensating control. Exactly. Yep. And I think you have described in the past, you'd be like, yep, Paul, like, that's all good. Like, what else are you going to do? Right. But if you said, well, what about this? And I'm like, oh, I didn't know about that. Like, that's bad. That's worse. Right. That's worse, I think.
Well, I'm formulating a talk that I'm going to give later this year at ShowMeCon. I have to come up with a clever title because I want to cover a little bit of a couple topics. One is, after all these years, I think I should give a talk and kind of explain why I'm always talking about PCI and why I'm always championing it and recommending it as a framework. Because not everybody's been listening to the show for years.
Curmudgeon.
But part of it is just trying to get people beyond that compliance mentality where I just want to do the bare minimum to the bare minimum of things so that I can get back to doing whatever else it is that they do. Because as you said, there's this mentality, and we saw it back when we worked for that vulnerability company.
Yeah. I talked about that. Yes.
That, if you find something that I have to deal with it, I would rather just, find as little as possible. Of course, soon to be the law of the land as of April 1st, one of the many changes with PCI 4.0 is that internal vulnerability scans are now going to be required to be credentialed or authenticated. And if you talk to most scan vendors, and I have, when you start doing the authenticated scans, you get a whole lot more results, typically. And that's what everybody's freaking out about. Of course, we've been trying to warn them as an industry for the last couple of years because the daggone standard was published back in 22. This is coming.
My approach to that would be, I'm not going to ignore vulnerabilities. I'm going to recognize them, but I'm going to prioritize them. And I run into this all the time with firmware at a very granular level because that's like my day job, right? So there are like vulnerabilities that will exist inside of firmware that are very much internal.
Right.
And I'm like, if an attacker would have to work really hard to get to that vulnerability, so much so that they wouldn't really need that vulnerability to accomplish their goals. So like whether I address this or not, it's really not going to change the game if I'm compromised.
Right.
And I don't want to say I give firmware vendors a pass, but in terms of priority, you have to give that, I think, a lower priority, right? You have to prioritize what is going to be in the attacker's path,
Right.
and allow them to accomplish their goals.
Right.
And there might be dozens of vulnerabilities that sure exist, but I'm like, the attacker already has root access. The fact that there's a kernel Linux kernel vulnerability on this firmware because it's running kernel version 2, I'm like, yeah, that's bad. I'm like, but the attacker probably doesn't need it. Like, it, they're going to use any number of other things. So I was recently actually trying to focus efforts on what's exposed, right? Like what vulnerabilities exist in listening services, the web service, SSH, whatever communications protocols
Right.
that you have. And then I'm like, also, I care about more about vulnerabilities in running processes than I do just binaries that are sitting on the system as a utility, right?
Right.
And so there needs to be like a pecking order. And so I'm not saying these aren't going to be addressed, and believe me, there are vendors that out there that are addressing all the vulnerabilities, and I give them the world of credit, because I'm like, you're doing more than most. Because like most of the time I lift the covers on firmware, I'm like, well, it's really bad. But there's other vendors that are like, yeah, we're addressing those vulnerabilities, and you should. It shouldn't go unaddressed in your process. But in terms of priority, right, we want to focus on what likelihood is an attacker gonna use that vulnerability.
Yeah, but again, Paul, that sounds really hard, and that sounds like it takes work, and you have to think about it. And all people want to do is get the scan report, and it tells them exactly what the severity level
I need
is.
a scan report, right?
And
what patches do I need to apply? Give me the scan report, and I'm off to the races. But that's it's not always as binary as that. Like, there's an exposure, there's a missing patch, therefore I have to apply the patch. Now, maybe the majority of them are that, but not always what the attackers are going at, right? Attackers are going after things like credentials and all kinds of stuff.
Well, ironically, the idea of vulnerability prioritization has been part of the PCI standards since 2010. It's just most people miss it, gloss over it, because the requirement that was introduced in 2010 is that you as an organization need to come up with your own vulnerability ranking based on whatever you want to base it on, make it your own, customize it, which gives people the opportunity to do prioritization. Of course, prioritization, that's a buzzword that's kind of come and gone in the last 6 or 7 years. It was a thing for a while,
right?
And now we've kind of moved on. But even when it was a thing several years ago, I'm like, PCI has allowed that since 2010, and I still say that.
Yeah.
But most of my clients, when it comes to that requirement, they say, well, we just kind of use the ranking that we get from Qualys or whoever their scan vendor is, and they do the 1 to 10, and what is it, 7 to 10 is critical, and whatever it is.
Yeah, but context matters.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, having a conversation about ATMs and people with physical access. Now your threat model is completely changed, right? I look at Microsoft's like Xbox, right, where they're delivering the device to people who have a motivation, an incentive to break into the device.
Right.
And so then now I'm like, okay, those kernel vulnerabilities matter more on those particular systems than they might on other particular systems. So I think a lot of it comes down to context for me.
Sure, absolutely. And ironically, it's a lot of the criteria that was built in, when we were at said company, CVEs version 2 came out and was applying a lot of those environmental subjective variables. But again, everybody wanted that to be built into the automated thing that's just spitting out the
Yeah,
result
it's hard.
without them contributing to the conversation.
Because attacker behavior plays into it too.
Mhm.
And so I look at, exposed security and network appliances and what the attackers are exploiting. I look at the Android ecosystem. There was a great Reddit thread that I almost included that I probably should have in the context of this discussion we're having of I forget which CVE it is, but it was one on Android, and it was like a medium severity Linux kernel bug that was being exploited actively in the wild. And it was an argument for how do we prioritize this stuff? How do we know? Like, we can't just ignore the mediums because some of those will crop up and be a problem for us.
Right.
And it's difficult to remediate all of them. How do we know which ones to remediate?
Right.
And that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is what kind of systems are we trying to protect, and which ones do we want to put the more effort to go? We want to address as many vulnerabilities as we can on those systems because of the threat model and attacker behavior and where they're deployed and a whole bunch of other factors, right?
Not promising that this
prioritization is important.
It is important.
It is, but it's it's a matrix, right? It's a more complex matrix than I believe many are viewing it as, right? Those that have the mindset of, I just want to tell me what patches I need to apply and which ones first, and don't tell me about anything new and novel that is difficult to defend because I'm not going to be able to do that.
Time.
That's the wrong mindset, right? It's what's the context of all of this? What are the highest priority systems that I have to defend my business or my product is the better question.
And it has to be risk informed in terms of the risk versus the value. But then you've got the problem of chained vulnerabilities. And this is a really complex factor. Let's be clear.
It is.
No, I agree. It is.
And I'm not going to promise this is the last time I bring up PCI tonight, but PCI in 4.0.
Are we drinking? Are we still drinking?
Yeah,
on PCI?
let's drink. What the hell?
I think we're still drinking.
Drink the PCI. But in 4.0, PCI is making companies come up with a plan of tell us when you are going to address, I believe that's the word that they use, the mediums and the lows and the informational findings, because the requirement for many years for vulnerability scans was take care of the criticals and highs. And of course, that's where the prioritization comes in. You can downgrade. Why are we not saying Tenable? I don't know. But Tenable,
everyone knows.
Everybody knows where
Jeff
we
and I
work.
work for Tenable.
I think the term we used there was recasting.
Recast the writ. Yeah,
and the game back then a few years ago was let's try to recast it so it's not critical or high, so we don't have to fix it within the time frame.
Yeah,
and we can pass that that particular requirement.
I think that name should actually be like re-rolling, because all we do is roll attribution dice. Now we're rolling risk dice.
Yeah, but it's a dangerous game because I think it has to be based somewhat on attacker behavior.
Now I have to build risk dice.
But also, I hate to say that, good threat intelligence should drive your prioritization.
Yeah.
Right. And I forget who did we have on the show that was CISO for a large financial, Scotiabank. What was his name?
Who was that? We're blanking.
Yeah, he was talking about basically that, threat intelligence saying that
it was recent too.
It was recent too. Yeah, threat actors are going after this particular security appliance, and if we measure the time from when a vulnerability is disclosed, when a patch is released, to when we actually start seeing exploits being thrown at our systems, is 24 hours.
I was going to say it was hours or minutes.
Right.
Even.
Yeah, that has to drive your response plan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it just does. Right.
What does this mean? We're ruining Friday nights for everybody. Go away.
But that's the reality of it, right? Yep. And I'm not saying every vulnerability deserves that, but there's lots of data points that we can pull from to help us. And I'm not saying it's an exact science either, right? But I like to think we're trying to err on the side of caution.
But
there's a lot. This is a. We could spend the whole show talking about all the different aspects that play into this,
right?
Because some of the aspects of playing is how easy or difficult is it for me to remediate the vulnerability? So it's a shared responsibility. I have to do things in my network that make it easy, but the vendors also need to do things that make it easy for me to remediate as well, right? The updates have to be reliable. The integrity checking and the tools they make available have to allow my systems to operate while I do that checking, because there's some vendors that, oh yeah, you can like run this check to see if you have malware on your appliances, but it means they have to go down for an hour or two. Well, that's not acceptable.
So
right?
let me, just to finish off my story about PCI, and they're now requiring that you have to have a plan, you have to have a time frame for addressing mediums and lows. I've actually already had a client, because we're close enough now to the everybody calls it a deadline, the effective date of the new requirements. I have a client right now. I was looking at their policy for how quickly do they remediate vulnerabilities, and when they got to lows, they said as time allows, and I said that's not going to cut it. As time allows is not an acceptable response. You got to come up with something. And they're like, oh my god. And of course, I'm talking to the GRC people that are handling all the paperwork that effectively probably the technical people never see, maybe. But so they were going to go back and try to talk to them about what can you live with, all the technical people that are bound by actually taking the actions. And I'm like, keep in mind, PCI is not saying it's got to be X number of days. They're saying you determine X, but it's got to be based on what PCI now calls a targeted risk analysis, what we used to call a risk assessment, which just makes sense. But starting to get companies actually to do it. So I asked,
don't ignore vulnerabilities forever.
I asked this esteemed panel, in your experience, and not holding you to it, but just because we're trying to establish, expert advice or advisory advice. What, in your opinion, is an appropriate time frame for an organization to address mediums, lows, and informational vulnerability findings?
Yeah, I think it depends.
Of course, it depends, but just spitball.
Yeah, it depends on the organization and the target, right? But I think you need to define a time frame that is less than 6 months. Like 6 months is maybe the kind of cutoff point
for what?
Because
Criticals?
For lower severity vulnerabilities, Josh, right? 6 months is I mean, there's a lot can happen in 6 months, right? And so I'd want to see progress being made like before that 6 month mark. In other words, I want to see organizations getting rid of their technical debt with kind of like that 6 month timer, because anything beyond that is kind of, in my mind, like ridiculous, right? And so you want to get on a cycle where you're constantly patching and remediating, and some faster than others, right? With kind of like the 6 months of, like, from time of when I knew about it, 6 months out is kind of like, I need a plan, right? Because then like after 6, to me, I don't know, that's just a kind of arbitrary.
Okay, so Paul's answer is, at least the bottom line is 6 months. What's your take on it, Joshua? Critical, high, medium, low.
Informational. Forgot informational. But I'm going to tell you that I think as a lowest common denominator, 6 months is simultaneously too long and too short. And I'm not trying to be rude, but here's the deal. 6 months is way too long for any kind of vuln, period. I don't think anybody's going to argue that. However, being that most companies that I talk to, and I talk to a lot of friggin' companies, okay, they're never even getting to barely the mediums if they're lucky.
Right.
And I mean, they're doing the criticals, they're doing the highs, they're doing them as fast as they can. And they get to mediums and they're like, I've got another project.
Right. Yeah, but so when you get to mediums and lows to me are more about hardening than it is like straight up remediation, right? Like mediums and lows get into like the regular process of, how often am I updating my systems? How often am I upgrading any piece of any asset that I have?
That's actually an interesting study.
Do you know what the most common way to get into a system is these days? Besides bad users, credential abuse. True, but in terms of actual, like what we would call a hack, okay, is chaining mediums.
Yeah,
criticals. Yeah, if you don't patch a critical after probably 24 hours, you're screwed. But the point is, everybody should be patching criticals within 24 to 72 hours maximum.
Yep.
Okay. Highs. 48 to 96 hours.
Mhm.
And by the way, this is not business hours, just being clear. This is
Yeah,
chronological
This
hours,
is clock hours.
clock hours, people.
Yep.
But mediums, people are like, it's been like 20 days. I'll hit it before I get to 30. No, because that with another medium is a hypervisor breakout, and you're toast. You're done.
Right.
Or Kubernetes breakout or whatever is the flavor of the friggin' day.
That's
And
what I mean.
so-
Having a process where you're constantly improving and addressing any kind of vulnerability exposure or whatever is where it's at for me, right? It's basically a
Okay.
DevOps philosophy
Mhm.
that you need to, and that's why I have the 6 month time, like anywhere from an hour to 6 months. Like
Okay.
your DevOps process has to be constantly applying patches and updating within those windows.
I'm going to diatribe for just a minute. Okay. I just talked to a buddy of mine, Ed McCabe. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's with Rubicon. Brilliant guy when it comes to risk quantification, like absolutely brilliant. Actually made a business of doing Monte Carlo simulations like that were unbelievable. We were joking about, sometimes our wives get weird deliveries. He goes, look, your wife loves you when she gets a pallet of computer equipment to build a Beowulf cluster. And her only question is not, give me all of your money and your credit cards so you can't spend anything, but should I call the electrician to put a 220 circuit in the garage?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, your wife loves you. But so like this dude does Monte Carlo simulations like they're, oh my God. And
I want to transition.
Before you
Just like an
transition,
internal-
I'd like to
yeah.
get Sam's take on the time
can I
frame.
finish the thought?
Oh, I don't have anything much to add
Okay,
to this one.
okay.
I had a troublesome problem I wasn't going to bring up of issues you find that just make trouble, which is what happened to me. Like if you're the database administrator, you can search through and find customers committing fraud. And in my experience, the boss doesn't want to know.
Mhm. Yeah.
But I decided that's just another issue where you have an acceptance.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, it's a concept of resiliency. We'll table that.
Okay.
I want to go to trolling Microsoft because I think both to basically keep on the vulnerability train, right? Security researchers disclosing vulnerabilities to any vendor. Let's talk about Microsoft in particular. I want to put it out there. I get both sides of this, and we've spoken with people from Microsoft. Jared DeMott, I thought it was a great interview to give Microsoft's side of it and provide me with some empathy for Microsoft. But also I have a lot of empathy for security researchers as well. Right? So I could take either side of this argument of you're a large vendor, software vendor, let's say, and you're a security researcher. Like I get both sides of this, right? Like the vendor wants as much information as possible about any potential vulnerabilities. The security researcher who may or may not have been immersed in this there's a significant time investment that many security researchers spend discovering a vulnerability. No, that's not always the case. Like sometimes you get lucky. I'm not going to discount that. Like sometimes you get lucky, and over the course of whatever you're working on, you're like, wow, that's a pretty glaring security vulnerability. But most often it's weeks, months of work to go, oh, that's a security vulnerability. So you're engrossed in it, and you tell the vendor, and you're like, I'm going to just cut right to the chase. This is a vulnerability, and it's bad. The security vendor's like, well, I want more information. And Microsoft, in this case, I don't know.
Is Paul's story 23, by the way.
And Sam had this story as well. And it was Will Doman, right? It was a prominent security researcher. I think that should play into it, right? I don't know. I mean, it's somewhat unfair to have this ranking or this list of well, if these people report the bug, don't harass them for more information because it's probably real. You get your Tavis Ormandi at the top of the list, but I don't want to play favorites, but Will would be on my list if it was my software at my day job where I'm working, and Will or Tavis or any number of prominent researchers, I'd be like, all right, yep, we gotta fix this. But Microsoft is no, you need a video. Yeah. And Will totally trolled them, which is one of the best trolls, I think, ever in vulnerability research.
Yeah, I mean, I can defend Microsoft here. This is a huge problem. I think more often than not, when you get a vulnerability report, you can't reproduce it because you can't understand it. This is a huge
Yeah.
problem.
I agree. I've been on both sides of this, Sam. I have. Like in my career, I've been on both sides of
Yeah.
it, 100%. And I get, like I said, I could take either side of this argument. And I mean, the hacker in me and the security researcher in me wants to side with security research. So like, Will, I get it, dude. And like your troll was friggin' awesome. So what Will did was Will created a bunch of screenshots and was like, look, this is how the vulnerability is exploited. And Microsoft basically was like, well, that's great. We need a video. And so Will created a video with like 14 minutes of basically like just on the same screenshot. And then at the end, he's like, this is how you, yeah. It had techno music in the background. What else was in the article? I mean, the troll was absolutely epic.
Zoolander.
Zoolander. Like, I don't fault Will at all for doing this. Like,
I'm watching the video now. I'm waiting for something to happen.
And there's just techno. Like, I get it. I get both sides of it. Like, I think it's a close race, but I side with Will on this one to be like, Microsoft, like, dudes, come on, like, this is a vulnerability. Like, just go fix it. Which is
this reminds me of the people that harass telephone marketers, and I really think you're punishing the wrong person. Some low-level person has to waste their time watching this. You're not getting the person who made the decision to require this video.
Dude, it's really funny. So I don't do as much as I could with the knowledge I have to protect my phone number from scams or calls or, whatever. And I get calls from security vendors. And recently I've got this tactic where I'm like, look, I know you're an SDR. And they're immediately, it's like silence. They're like, what the fuck? How does this person know like what role I play in this organization? I'm like, you're likely outsourced to some other company. I'm like, but tell you what, I'm not your target. I know your job is really hard. I know you're basically cold calling people. I'm like, I'm not your target. I wish you the best of luck. I hope you sell as much as you can, but I'm not your target. And that tends to, they're like, oh, like I'm going to go on to the next person now.
Yeah. This is what I think is the most kind thing to do. Don't waste their time. They're just trying to do their job. And if you scream and yell at them, it's not going to change it.
Yeah. If I'm like, what the F, why are you calling me blah, blah, blah. Like that's not gonna be, I'm like, dude, I know what your job is. I know how hard it is. Like I empathize. It's basically empathy. Like I empathize with you. I'm like, I'm not the buyer for your product. Like you go to the next person. I don't want to waste your time. Because I know you've probably got hundreds in a given day of people on your list. Like move on to the next person, dude. Go find that next sale to hopefully you keep your job, right? Like it's a tough market right now.
Well, I think regarding this trolling video, you just have a fundamental cultural problem, which has been the one from the beginning. The hackers are sort of unruly and disgruntled and easily offended and very technical. And the company people are less technical and busy and just want to see things orderly. And there's just a fundamental conflict there that you can never really resolve.
Right. I get Microsoft. Do you know how many bug reports Microsoft gets on any given day? Like their MSRC team, first of all, MSRC team is amazing. There's amazing people that work there. I've interviewed a good number of them, and many of us know the people working for MSRC. Amazing people, right?
Yeah.
But also they're like, help us out. If you're reporting a bug, give us the most amount of information possible. I mean, Casey, a bug crier, will tell you this too. Anyone involved with disclosure will tell you that too. And I know it's frustrating for the security researcher. I'm like, yeah, I know this bug inside out, backwards, forwards. I've tested it a million times. I've validated it. And then I go tell you about it and you're like, oh, you need to give I get the frustration.
Well, I used to be doing basic scientific research, and I had to learn this. When I gave my first talk of this exciting thing, a guy fell completely asleep in the back row.
Yeah.
And I was amazed. This is the greatest thing ever. But I didn't give him any background. So he had no idea what I was talking about. It is real hard for an expert to get back to the mind of a non-expert and understand what is the background they need to know to see what I've accomplished here.
No, I get this. Is something I learned from Sam's, right? You get so deep down the rabbit hole, you're like, holy shit, look at this. But you're so deep in the rabbit hole that you don't come up to the higher level executive summary. Why do people
Yeah.
care? It's one of my biggest frustrations right now when we cover the industry and the community and the hacker culture, right? Is I read so many articles where they're just diving right in. And I'm like,
Yep.
if you would just take a step back and be like, why does this matter? Why do people
Yeah.
care? Start with
Yeah.
that. It's so many disclosures I read, quite frankly.
Yeah.
I'm like,
I feel like
I don't
every
even know what
yeah.
product you're talking about. I'm
Yeah.
like, hold on. I literally have to pause every single week when I read at least one disclosure where I'm like, I don't even know what product you're talking about. Like, what does that product do? Who makes that product? Okay, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is, okay, who uses that product? And then the third thing is like, for what purpose? And like, I have to fill in all of those blanks with
Yeah.
Google and LLMs, like helping me out along the way. And they go, oh, okay, I get it now. Then I come back to your research. But all you need, really, it's like a paragraph or two at the top.
Yeah.
An executive summary. Why do people care?
Yeah,
Right?
this is why I think every conference should have a rule that the first couple of slides have to say, what did you do and why do I care, with no formulas, or just in normal English, what does it mean and why do
Right.
I care?
But also, this is beneficial to all of us doing security research right now. Like this is not a detriment to your research, because I fully understand how much work goes into security research, right? You spent weeks, months, sometimes a year or more doing this research. Like, make it so that it has an impact, that people get it by just taking a step back, or ask for help. I'll volunteer myself. If you need help with that, I'll volunteer to help with that.
This
Let's talk
almost
about
sounds like
who
a
uses
talk,
it,
if
why
not
do
a
people care?
workshop for a conference, to just teach
Yeah,
some basic
no, I agree.
techniques.
Why do
Yeah,
people care?
This is why we need non-technical people like advertising and marketing types in
Mhm.
security. We need people that can communicate with non-technical people.
Right. Sands taught me this 25 years ago, right? They were like, if you're going to do something technical, focus on the technical, but make sure that you have that little piece of content that's like the why. Like, why do people care? Like, set the stage for it. And that should be a small piece of your content. But I find that today a lot of people miss that. I think it's a lot of the early Sands people, like Alan Paller, God rest his soul, Stephen Northcutt, like a lot of those people stepped down. But those two individuals in particular taught me you got to make people care about it first. And also, don't focus on that too much, because like you lose credibility if you focus on like the non-technical stuff, like way like the about. That's what they called it, the about. They're like, if you focus on the about too much, people are going to lose interest. But the about is super important. Distill it down. But again, Microsoft, Will Doman, like
halfway through the
it's
video, still waiting for something to happen. All it's been
Right.
for like 5 minutes is just the
Epic
flashing
troll,
cursor.
and I get it on both accounts. I really do. AI crawlers. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, because many of us have tried to write crawlers, whether it's in cybersecurity or outside of cybersecurity. Like, there's a lot of usage for crawlers, right? But I'm super excited about using AI and specifically LLM technology to augment crawlers. And this is it ties into my day job in a big way. I haven't seen any great like breakthroughs, Sam. I don't know if you've seen breakthroughs in this area of research, Sam. I'm just excited about what the future might bring for AI and LLMs with respects to crawlers. But
Well, I haven't looked at that, but this article in the Register that I link is about they're the standard crawlers that every search engine has just to harvest the data from your website.
right.
And the AI is just their motivation of the company using the crawler. They're not using AI in the crawler. But the problem is their crawlers are too vigorous. And if you're a code hosting website, then if somebody says download all the code, that is a huge amount of traffic, far more than normal. So it's actually freezing up the companies, and they're deploying defenses Now, some of the AIs claim they will respect the robots.txt file, which is, of course, the classical answer. But obviously, some of them don't. I remember Perplexity was accused of ignoring robots.txt, at least in the early days. And they say that they're getting flooded with too many AIs. So now they're deploying a tar pit to trap and waste time of the crawlers.
Nice.
But this has always
Yeah.
been a cat and mouse game when it comes to crawlers. Whatever the purpose
Yeah.
of the crawler, to your point, Sam, it's
Yeah.
always been a cat and mouse game, right?
Well, most websites, I don't think it matters that much because they don't have a huge repository of content that is rarely accessed. But maybe they do.
But if you do,
Yeah.
it can tie up your site, and they're going to put countermeasures in place, and the AI is going to
Yeah.
look at countermeasures to the countermeasures, and it's going to be a cat and mouse game, right?
If you
It
have an
seems to me
arms
like they
race
must
to
have poorly
access
programmed
content,
crawlers. If they keep making this much traffic forever, they must keep reloading the same page over and over when they don't really need to. But anyway,
it could be a poorly, and I've seen AI LLMs trying to use that technology to augment crawlers and still kind of fall short. Like, I can see some of them causing issues on sites, as your article points to, but also the ones that I've seen, it works on some sites but not others. And crawling is it's a huge pain in the ass to write a crawler, by the way, but
the one that
important
works
to a
right,
lot of
yeah.
cybersecurity activities.
Well, and now you've
Yeah.
got so this arms race of crawler versus content holders, content repositories, is going to result in a significant problem for indexing of all of these sites and all of this content. Where is this going to end up? You're going to have to pay to index?
Well, that's what people
That's
want. Like Reddit sold the right to index their stuff, and they'll only give it to you if you pay for it. And the New York Times wishes they'd done that. I think this is going to be the standard. You don't let people crawl your site without paying first.
Oh man.
Yeah, the payment is interesting. Like,
So
let's say you wanted to
okay,
crawl websites and get all the vulnerabilities in a specific advisory. Just throwing that out there as an example. That sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's really hard.
Yeah, there's already paid threat intel feeds. That's essentially
Yeah.
what it would be.
And a lot of that technology is based on crawlers. And a lot of the technology for years has implemented LLMs to help them with that, because they're like, oh, if I can use this new technology to help me be better at that, I will. And it is an arms race. It really is. I don't know. I kind of side on the
what's that going
information.
to affect?
Information should be free. Like, publish an RSS feed, publish a data standard. Like, the data standard in this case, to me,
Exists.
is an RSS feed that basically spits back XML, or like JSON. It's essentially JSON, right? And if you have that, we can all parse it and do that in a like mindful, respectful manner that doesn't take down the target websites. Back to your article, right? Like, everyone just wants to consume the information to do what we need to do with it, and not all crawlers have that malicious intent.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
I mean,
the crawlers for
logically,
what vulnerabilities exist in all the products, as an example, it's not a malicious intent. It's to help increase the security of
No,
organizations.
I think you've got a good plan. You figure out what you want to make public, and you just publish that deliberately. And the rest of it is behind something where the crawler
And
can't get to it.
RSS is great. I
Yeah.
mean, it's what gave birth to podcasting, quite frankly. I mean, so
Yeah.
it's a great standard for that.
So what's the effect of this going to be?
Well, I think people that want to make public repositories, like GitHub, are going to have to consider this. I think it's like we deploy other kinds of defenses. You'll have to deploy anti-crawler defenses like tar pits as a routine activity now, I think.
Right. And then your LLMs will be tuned to get around those.
That.
In
Right.
certain, like, what if you wanted to crawl? Like, I've written crawlers or advise people writing crawlers to, hey, you've got a security conference and all your vendors and booths are in a website, but it's not in an RSS feed, and I want to consume it. So I'm going to write a crawler to just basically scrape your website. Website scraping, right? Crawlers are basically scraping to, like, scrape that data so that I can be more efficient when I go to the conference, right? So it's like this weird debate. Like, is it in the conference's best interest to publish an RSS feed, like easily consumable data, I should say, so that people can consume it? Or do they want to gate that and and not allow that to be like this is public knowledge. Why not make it easily consumable? It's a great debate.
It seems to me like you could easily block it at the IGS. You could regard anybody that keeps fetching many, many pages from the same IP address as a DDoS attack.
Well, and there's lots of defense. I mean, but also we scrape and crawl data for open source intelligence gathering, right? And then LinkedIn will put up huge gates to that, but then the LinkedIn data ends up on Google, so I hit Google for that. I mean, that was like 10, 15 years ago example. I don't know where it stands today, but
yeah,
there are a few GitHub projects. If you go search hard, I wish I had them off the top of my head, but if you go search, there are a few GitHub projects that are using LLM AI technology to enhance crawling, and I think it's super cool, because if you've ever written a crawler or scraper for any purpose, whatever it is, you have battle wounds from that. You have scars, right? And the reason I'm excited is maybe I don't have as many scars if I can use LLM type technology to do that. So,
what does the LLM do? Just guess the names of files from the ones you found or something?
We'll have to take that conversation offline, Sam.
Okay.
One of my coworkers who's way better at LLMs than I am, looked into it, because I was like, dude, what about this? And he's like, well, actually, it falls down in XYZ scenarios.
Yeah, it seems like Derby already does this without the LLM.
Right. Yeah, there's some pretty cool crawler technology. Does anyone recognize room 641A? Does that ring a bell?
I thought it was 614A.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, 641A, you're right.
It is, no, 641A is the room, specifically, in this case, in the AT&T data center in San Francisco, where Mark Klein was the person who leaked this information to that room in the data center. I think it was 2006. Basically had fiber optic technology that allowed the NSA to collect traffic. And there was a whole hoopla about that. And the reason it comes up today is that Mark Klein, I think it was 78. What story number is that of mine? Hold on, I have to find it. Oh yeah, AT&T technician who exposed secret NSA spying has passed away.
Yeah, it was like the earlier Snowden.
Yeah, age 79. He passed away. So Klein went public in 2006. I'm reading from the TechCrunch article. Revealed the NSA was using a secret room in AT&T's hub in San Francisco to tap into the backbone of the internet and spy.
And that there were such rooms in every aggregation point backbone room. Yeah,
correct. The EFF filed a law. There were several lawsuits that resulted in that. If you read the one of the links in here, the link in this article goes to Wikipedia, which also begs another question. I was thinking about it. Is an LLM like the next evolution of Wikipedia? Right? In terms of like when we research stuff, like I ask an LLM, tell me about this topic, right?
Actually,
LLM is like an evolution. It's like the next generation Wikipedia. Like Wikipedia is crowdsourced information about a particular topic, but an LLM is kind of like a digital automated. If we're just looking at it in research terms,
I'm
researching a topic, right? An LLM is kind of the next evolution of Wikipedia.
No, because it's also crowdsourced editing and crowdsourced fact checking. And
it's better. It's better than. So that was my point, John. LLM is better than Wikipedia because it uses Wikipedia as a source, but many other sources, and has.
No, but you're assuming that the LLM is as smart as a human, and they very much are not.
I think there's an academic paper to compare and contrast Wikipedia as a source versus LLM as a source for any given topic.
I'd like to see that. Yeah.
Right. I was just thinking like an LLM is the 2025 version of Wikipedia, but there's a lot more nuances in there.
That would be like the next version of the Turing test. And deciding how are they really as smart as people? Well, that would be a scientific way to quantify that.
Because people have certain agendas and motives that we've seen applied to Wikipedia, right? Does an LLM inherit those incentives or not? Or is it able to pull from multiple sources to get around some of the bias? Yeah. But we also know LLMs are biased based on what we've as humans have published. I think it's interesting because I've asked LLMs about a certain topic and also read the Wikipedia page about a certain topic. And as a human, I'm consuming both of those and making my own decisions. So, but the Wikipedia page for Room 641A is an interesting read. I can't attest to how accurate any of the data is, but imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today.
I don't want to say much about this, but I will say on the Wikipedia page, it does highlight the fact that this activity was authorized because of the Patriot Act after 9/11.
Yeah,
so
I agree.
This is not this is not Snowden-esque in the sense that Mark Klein was whistleblowing something that, and I'm reading into this, that he thought was illegal. Maybe he did, but my contention always with people when Snowden was the thing was, feel free to question what they're doing, but they're doing it based on the authority granted to them by Congress. So if you have a beef, go to Congress.
And I believe it was Obama who cleaned up the Patriot Act at a certain juncture, right?
Yeah, there was additions or
there was amendments,
modifications, and how often it had to be revisited and reauthorized. I don't
the whole FISA
begin to know the details.
The whole thing. Yeah.
But my contention when people were running around with Snowden and basically saying NSA's gone off the deep end, they're doing all sorts of illegal things. I'm like, it's not the NSA that I know. Maybe they're going closer to the edge than people are accustomed to, but they're doing things within the boundaries of what they're allowed to do as authorized by Congress.
Which we did as a nation in the interest of national security, right?
Well, and I think there's fair questions to be made about that time, and to some degree it still extends to this day, although it's throttled back a lot, I think. But we suspended habeas corpus and that was the essence of the Patriot Act, meaning you didn't have to have a reason to detain or a reason to do this. It was just that was all sort of set aside. The concept in law of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means, somebody quote the Latin, you got to have a body. There's got to be evidence of a crime.
Evidence of a crime to detain someone.
So that you have the due process. So due process.
But if you're outside the U.S., habeas corpus doesn't apply, and that was definitely in play.
Well, that's always been the charter of NSA is to do what NSA does to everybody else but U.S. citizens. What changed with the Patriot Act was now they were doing things US internally. And they were sweeping up everything, U.S. citizens and people with visas and people not. They
the phone call record. I think that was in one of the documentaries with Snowden about the phone calls and monitoring. Right? Was again, I think they were operating. I don't know. I don't want to mince words, but I understand. They may or may not have been operating within the U.S. laws at the time, which were amended as a result of the Patriot Act to go, if it was a U.S. citizen, but they were talking to people in certain nation states, those call records were able to be obtained. And it was just wasn't the content of the calls, from what I understand, it was call
headers,
records,
the headers,
the header, you're right, like the header, like TCP/IP, like header information before phone calls
Mhm.
about who they were talking to.
Yep. Yeah, let's leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, moving along, where are we going next? Let's take the next one. A real ESP32 vulnerability. So many may have seen I forget the name of the firm, but there was a security firm that was like, there's really bad things in the HCI interface in the Bluetooth driver in ESP32 chips, right? And they described it initially, remember, as a backdoor, and then they backed off of that, and they're like, no, it's just hidden features. And then Espresso was like, is the company behind the ESP32 chip. They're like, it's not a backdoor. They're just undocumented commands. And this isn't a remote attack. Like, an attacker would need to be executing code or have access to an ESP32 system in order to abuse the vulnerabilities that were disclosed. And that got a ton of press. What strikes me is that this article did not get a ton of press. It's my story number 18. NCC Group issued a technical advisory for actual vulnerabilities that are remotely exploitable in ESP32 systems that could give attackers the ability to execute remote code remotely on ESP32 systems. This didn't get like hardly any press, which is
Not to pick on you, but
super.
are there other ways to execute remote vulnerabilities, remote exploits other than remotely? I guess you could do it
Correct.
locally.
You could do
You
it
could do a
locally.
local
But again,
remote
if you're local
exploit.
already, do you need
I think
to?
I made that. It's a great point, Jeff, right? That was my point earlier.
Yep.
Like, if you're already
There.
have unauthorized presence on the system, what else could you escalate to?
Mhm.
Right? We could speculate what that is. But this is a remote so for these were disclosed in the a reference implementation in ESP32 system. So how do I put this? If you're going to develop code for an ESP32 chip, right, you're going to inherit a lot of libraries and code depending on how deep you want to get into development, right? So like the deepest level of development is you use Espresso's ESP IDF, which gives you the most control over the code that is executing on this microcontroller. Most people kind of go a level up from that and use a development framework such as Arduino, right, which uses a single-threaded, free RTOS system that inherits a bunch of libraries to make things a lot easier for you. In all these cases, right, you might have reference code that comes from Espresso or others that are examples of how you would implement a Bluetooth implementation, as an example. The vulnerability that was discovered in NCC Group was part of the expressive SDK, if you will, but was in their example code. Now, many people, like myself included, right? Like, this gets into like really low level stuff, and there's different levels of it. I may just take the reference code and implement that in my own code. So NCC Group was like, well, there's vulnerabilities in the reference code. And Espresso was like, well, we're not going to issue CVEs. We're not going to call this a security vulnerability because I think my reasoning is that it was in the example code, right? Now to Espresso's credit, they patched the reference code. However, if you copied that reference code into your code, which is what that's what I do, right?
Oh, yeah.
Then you have that vulnerability in your own code. And this vulnerability is it's significant. It's a classic buffer overflow. I've actually seen this buffer overflow, like this mistake by a developer in the reference code or in code in UEFI, where that you want to allocate a buffer, and rather than saying like, this is the fixed length of this buffer. I'm not going to accept any user inputted data that goes beyond this this size of the buffer. Instead, you allocate the buffer for like whatever the size of the data being passed by the user. That's what I'm going to allocate on the stack, and that's the mistake that they made, right? Like you want to do proper memory management at this level. You want to say this is the max value that this buffer this variable can be defined as. But the mistake in the code is whatever value is passed in, then I'm just going to allocate whatever buffer. That's what leads to the buffer overflow.
What I
And that's essentially
what I
what
think
happened
you're inferring, Paul, and I want to make sure I'm clear. You use reference code, and you're kind of done. And later on, that reference code is found to have a vulnerability, and it gets updated. Who or what or where and when and why and how are you being compelled to update the reference code that you used however long ago
That's
to write
correct.
your code?
Yeah.
You'll do it out of the goodness of your heart and your,
No,
your,
there's
your
a- there's a,
dedication to
Is this not
history.
part of why S-bombs are coming about, so that people are more informed?
S-bombs are definitely part of this, right? Like reference code has been historically the source of some of these problems, supply chain security problems, right? In that the Intel and Microsoft, an example, or Intel makes available EDK2, which is a reference code for UEFI. Vendors adopt that code, but if there's a vulnerability, TPMs are the same way. Like it's in the reference code, and this is really, and I think ESP32 falls in this category of like this is really low level stuff that you, maybe you don't want to implement on your own. So I'm just taking what's in the reference code, and in that process, I'm inheriting a supply chain vulnerability because it was in the reference. And since multiple vendors took it in the reference code and just implemented that directly, now vendors X plus one or whatever like have this particular security vulnerability because they inherited the reference code.
But I'm not meaning to pick on you, but earlier in our segment, you talked about the idea of prioritization. And if it's firmware, it's sort of, in your mind, automatically a lower priority. Does this particular vulnerability and circumstance change your position on prioritization?
Well, no, not just that it's not that it's firmware and it's a lower priority. It's that inside the firmware, Jeff, there are vulnerabilities that are easily accessible and ones that are only accessible once an attacker has privileges, right? So there's many different.
So again,
you're
asking that organizations that use these things are thinking about it and aware and knowledgeable and do the research.
Well, I think that should reflect in the score. Like the CVSS scoring will highlight it. Like, is this remotely exploitable or is it locally exploitable? Should be factor it into the score
for this particular vulnerability because it's in firmware and it's is inherited a proper word to use. Inherited
I don't know how
code.
that impacts the score, but this vulnerability, Jeff, is remotely exploitable.
Right, but does that,
in other words,
that would influence the score? But is there a scan plugin out there, to use our language, looking for this, capable of looking for this?
That's a good question. You almost have to look at the source code to see if you had this vulnerability,
which most scan engines aren't doing.
No,
authenticated
and that's what I wrote
or
in this
not.
article, right? Like, yeah, Espresso fixed it in the reference implementation, but if you took the reference implementation, implemented it in your own code, now you got to go back through your own code and go, am I vulnerable or not? So it's a supply chain issue in that I can't say that like your version blah 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 of Espresso 32 because I don't know like what code you took from the reference implementation and what code you didn't, right? This goes back to your own code. Are you vulnerable or not?
Well, and this reminds me of the conversation we had with Corman. Forget when it was. I think it was the last time we talked to him. The reference code is vulnerable and you used it, but then somebody used your code as reference code, and then and then somebody else used that code as reference code, where does the buck stop, and where's the accountability fall, and where's the liability fall?
And the tracking too. Like you have to backport the fixes now into your own code, increment the version of your own code, and then it gets super hard to track.
But I mean, my recollection of Josh's position, what he was pushing for was, and I forget the term that he used, but you're the consumer that's using this code that with all this inherited vulnerability through layers and layers. He was pushing for, it's not you, the consumer. It's like the last organization that put this code into a product or a piece of code that you're using as essentially a consumer. I wish I could remember what the term was, but that's kind of where he was going for, is the liability and the accountability goes to sort of that last entity before it becomes published, available, public, whatever it is.
Right. So this is like an actual vulnerability that is remotely exploitable versus
you said that
previous.
So it's a big deal.
So it's a bigger deal.
It's a bigger deal, but the question still remains: who's finding it? Who's looking for it? Who's dealing with it? Who's responsible for it? Because at the end of the day, it's going to be some company that gets exploited because it's there, and it's a supply chain attack ultimately.
Correct.
This is why we drink, by the way, audience.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that, dude.
For sure.
So it's interesting how we.
Right, you talk while I go pee because I really have.
Go ahead.
We got you covered.
I actually want to go back to something I said earlier, which is when I said I was going to diatribe for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Risk, whether it's software, hardware, supply chain, whatever, risk is debt. We have technical debt, right?
Yep.
Sam can talk for hours about technical debt, right, Sam?
And we may need to, debt, depending on how long Paul's peeing
for. Yeah. I mean, Jeff, you can talk about compliance debt for a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
But any risk is a debt of sorts. And it's interesting that we don't carry risk on our balance sheets like we do technical debt, like we do development debt, like we do. Go ahead, Sam.
That's because we lack security metrics. We can't quantify a risk in terms of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
You can, though. You absolutely can. But it's awkward, annoying, ugly, unpleasant, and a pain in the ass. And you do it point in time.
To the point where I tell most organizations, when I talk about quantifying risk or risk equation, I say, don't get hung up on algorithms and formulas and coming up with values. Just know that risk is something that you want to make lower. And I just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. So risk is something you want to make lower. Right. I'm good with that.
Yep.
However, you've got the fact that you really need to understand what risk is. If you don't know what your risk is in dollars, how can you make appropriate decisions about it?
Well, you said the key element in dollars, because risk is at the all the equations that I've ever seen, their origin is in finance and accounting. So it's all dollars and
cents.
Dollars. And it's complicated because you're trying to quantify what would you lose monetarily if something
XYZ happened,
bad happens, but
or something changes.
To identify it, to quantify it, to qualify it, to come up with a fix or a remediation or a compensating control, all of those things cost money.
Right.
And how do you begin to decide what's enough to spend to protect against this potential bad outcome, to the point where, if I'm being really curmudgeonly, I think we've all lost, and nobody can afford to do everything that they need to do to protect against everything. No. So then we get more into risk tolerance, risk appetite.
Yep.
And it's all very subjective, and I went around.
No, but it's not.
It is.
If you have the ability to put risk into dollars, it becomes objective. right?
Sure, but can anybody actually do that? I think all
Yes.
you can do is make a very rough approximation.
No, you can actually do it very accurately to certain levels of accuracy. I'm not saying down to the penny, but down to the I think $100 down to the $10, you absolutely can. Okay.
How do you do that? How can we all
There's-
do that?
Well, it's a pain in the ass, but
And it costs
the
money
current state of the
and effort.
yes, it does,
and
but
time.
it's getting better. The current state of the art is from the FAIR Institute and a derivation of the FAIR Institute methodology, and it has to do with Monte Carlo simulations. And if you've never done a Monte Carlo simulation,
You've said that several times now. Could, for the benefit of the audience and me,
That's-
briefly define what is a Monte Carlo simulation?
I thought it
Monte
was
Carlo-
like your.
I'm thinking it's a
simulator for, like,
casino.
the car,
So
or a car.
Well,
I
so
thought it was like the car,
or a
like you're
place?
simulating
No.
driving a Monte Carlo, and
Yeah.
it comes from the casino. It's named
It
after
is
the
a
casino.
casino.
'Cause
Okay.
If I know if I remember the story correctly, the gentleman that came up with this was because his brother-in-law was a really shitty gambler. So he realized he could model his brother-in-law's behavior and he could predict how much he would lose. And the long story, but the basic idea of a Monte Carlo simulation is that you look at various factors. Okay. You have a firewall. You don't have a firewall. You have an any rule. You don't have an any rule. You have EDR. You don't have whatever, various factors. And you model them and you run simulations based on what happens if I have or don't have a firewall. What is the dollar value? Now you have to assign dollar values. If you get it wrong, you're going to screw up your dollar value. Let's be clear. But if you can get it right on the values you assign, and if I'm bastardizing this and getting it wrong, somebody please correct me. I'd love to be corrected on this. But the idea is you model these simulations and then you run an infinite number of simulations, not literally infinite, but a lot of them, to find points on the graph where you are wrong. Seriously, no joke. Because if you can find enough points on the graph where you are wrong, you can then infer by the pattern of where you are not wrong, or where you don't land, rather, what is right. Okay? And so if I have a firewall, I don't have a firewall, plus combined with I have an EDR, I don't have an EDR, combined with the factors, various factors, and it creates a graph of with one factor turned off or turned on, 2 factors, 3 factors, 4 factors, how much my dollar value is off or is at risk. You cannot decide what is correct, but you can decide what is wrong. It's a characteristic of the math. Don't ask me to explain. I'm still studying it. But based on what is wrong, and if I run enough simulations, imagine the graph is a square and there's a line on it that is correct. That is the amount of dollars I lose or is at risk with the various factor changes, right? I can tell where I'm wrong. It's sort of like Battleship. Think of the game Battleship. Because if you have enough pins that are wrong, you're like the damn ship's right there because that's the only place I haven't hit that's 5 across.
Yeah, that
It's
makes
got to
sense.
be there.
Right.
Okay.
It kind of reminds.
I want to come back to the ESP32 thing for a second. And
Well, we went in a
Espresso's-
different direction, Paul.
You
and
did,
you
yeah. I just
sort of
wanted to
lost
take a-
the floor when you went and had to go pee-pee.
I'm sorry.
But it is
Nature
your
call,
show,
but,
so I'll shut up.
I just want to come back to Espresso's decision not to issue a CVE for this particular vulnerability, which kind of begs the question of when do we issue a CVE for software? Now, one could say this vulnerability existed in example or reference code that tied back to a particular version of their repository, right? But others may have taken this code, implemented all or portions of it in their own code, and it's either similar or not dissimilar to their reference code. And how do we determine that? So, like, how do we determine transient vulnerabilities, if you will, in code that we don't know, like, how much they derive?
I do
from
not
the
think you
original
used
code
the
or
right
not.
word there, but I understand where you're going. I don't think
I
transient's
don't know
the
what
right
word
word.
means, but
I agree with you, Jeff. I don't
I
think
do
I
not
used all
think
the
that
right
word
words,
means
but
what
you know
you
where I'm
think it
going,
means.
right?
I know where
Yeah.
you're going.
inconceivable.
But it's like this
Transportable, maybe.
It's like an inheritance. Like how much DNA do I share
Mhm.
with the original one, right?
Right.
And it's an interesting to me area of security research in how do we determine the similarities or dissimilarities between code to determine if they contain the same vulnerability,
Aren't
right?
not to pick on your terminology, but aren't most CVEs based on software these days? Or what percentage of CVEs?
CVEs are based on software and tied, hopefully tied back to a version of that software,
Right.
right? So, like, to me, on the surface, this met the criteria of, well, Espresso puts a version number on their SDK or whatever, right? Their code, which also includes some examples, but I may derive my code from that original SDK. But I'm like, how much of those example code I'm using? Because like literally this vulnerability was in the folder in their GitHub repository called examples, right? So like my code may use any 0 to 100% or anywhere in between of that example code. So from a vulnerability identification standpoint, how do I know if I have that vulnerability or not? The only way I would know,
you run a scanner, and if it doesn't pop,
you run a scanner,
you're fat, dumb, and happy.
But you're running a scanner, and then you have to do decompilation and break it down to source code.
But I'm only going to get dinged from a compliance perspective if I have a finding on the scan. If I don't have a finding, I don't have a problem.
Right.
Which we talked about earlier. Aren't looking
most
for
scanners.
this.
Most scanners aren't going to the level of decompilation and comparing on a similarity basis how much I have of that code versus my own code.
So for the small percentage of listeners out there that actually care, what do they do to find it because they can't rely on the scan result? And
you have to go in your code. So like
which is where an SBOM might help if you actually have the SBOM.
Yeah, SBOM. Yeah, but it's more, I don't know, this is something we talk about at work. Like how do we find code, right, from whatever software, like version doesn't matter. How do we find code that I'm like, that's a vulnerability? Like regardless of what version it is, regardless of the SBOM, that vulnerability looks just in this code. Like I decompiled this binary and I looked at the code, and that looks just like maybe there is a published CVE for similar code, and that looks the same, right?
Right.
And technology wise, how do we implement that? That's actually one of the things we're working on at my day job.
Out of curiosity, at your day job, how much time do you devote to trying to figure out a plugin, to use our term, for a scan engine to actually find this kind of stuff?
To find this stuff, quite a bit. It depends on where it is. Right?
Does it mean that we have to have? I mean, does your company provide some sort of a scan product?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we do. Yes.
Not trying to make a plug for this.
No. But like, it's an interesting problem to try.
Do you share that type of plugin? This is kind of a, in the interest of security for all. Do you share that kind of plugin type of information for your product with other scan vendors, or do you assume that they kind of pick it up in their own way? And
no, we build it into our own product, right? But also we try and make it in the interest of making it generic enough to detect either a vulnerability or malicious behavior. We might detect it in places you wouldn't think of, right? So the hope, like this is a great use case for if you're to automate like the reverse engineering and hunting for bugs. Could you find it in someone's code that maybe not even know that they inherited this bug from Espresso, right? Maybe they don't listen to the show. Maybe they didn't pay attention to Espresso, but I had this vulnerability in my code. Maybe I changed it, but not enough, so I'm still vulnerable. How do you detect that? This is, I think, a real cutting edge area of cybersecurity that we're working on. Hopefully I didn't give away too much and my management isn't mad at me.
We'll find out tomorrow if you're still working for them.
If nothing else, it shows we're being very innovative in our thinking, right? So,
but I guess my question is, to what degree do you take this innovative thought that you obviously are passionate about and believe in and only packaged in your product versus making it at some level shareable, available for for other companies?
I will say we'll do the disclosure to whatever vendor is responsible,
and then leave them to do the work.
Correct.
That's fair, I think.
Similarly, do we need a CVE for every default credential? So this is some research I took upon myself to do. So there's two different vulnerabilities that I or one is it? Yeah. So two different So who was it? Akamai published research on an Edimax camera, and they said the Edimax IC7100 has a vulnerability, and we saw attackers exploiting it in the wild. And we did a little bit of research on that and published kind of like not a lot of details on that. So I went and found the firmware for an Edimax 7100 camera, which turns out, I believe from what I can determine, was end of life in 2014. So you can imagine the vulnerabilities that exist in a firmware that's been neglected since 2014, right? And they were picking on one particular vulnerability that was like a command injection in the NTP variable setting, which I wasn't able to easily like discern.
Is that a vulnerable? What? All right. So end of support, end of life, 2014. When was this particular vulnerability discovered?
The article was posted like this week.
Okay. So it's a vulnerability that presumably has existed for over 10 years in the software, but somebody just now.
Yeah.
And it's been
the Akamai article said that they saw it being exploited. Okay. I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting.
Did anybody show Dan that to see how many are still left out there?
Yeah, probably quite a few.
Yeah, I mean, cameras
for attackers to go after them, right? There's got to be some out there that they're targeting with a Mirai variant. Was what the article said. So I'm like, all right, that's cool. But when I ran that firmware from Edimax through Emba, which is my go-to like automated go find vulnerabilities in this firmware, Emba said, well, that's kind of neat. I saw an Etsy password file, and inside of that were some hashes, and I cracked those hashes, and I determined that the username of admin, the default password was 1234. I'm like, well, that's cool. I'm like, doesn't the documentation state that? So I downloaded the documentation for the Edimax IC7100, and sure as shit, right in the documentation, it says the default password is admin123. I'm like, so I didn't need Emba or some reverse engineering tool to tell me that that's the default password because it's right in the documentation. But then I saw another firm based out of some other country, some research group that had a CVE published for a TP-Link router that was only distributed in India. This is a crazy story. So it was only distributed in India. And they said that they reverse engineered the firmware. I'm assuming they reverse engineered the firmware, discovered that the default password was admin with a password of 1234. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And they got a CVE published for that. But their documentation for that, so the TP-Link documentation for that router that was, in my estimation, only distributed in India, says the default password for the web interface was admin. And what the research firm said was that if you were to get like command line access or serial console access, the password is admin1234. And I think that's why they were pushing for a CVE, because they're like, this wasn't published in the documentation. It's not in the web interface, but like the real root level. So admin was the name of the account, but the UID is 0, essentially root on the system.
That's not essentially root. That is root.
It is root. Yep. Thank you, Jeff. It is root, right. The root password, but the username just happens to be admin, but the UID is 0 is 1234. And so I was like, okay, like I'll give you that. Like you wanted a CV issued for that, but also my estimation is on the Edimax case, that is the default password for the web interface, but also for any other way to access the system, including like UART or whatever. So it's basically the same thing. So I'm like, are we now going to issue CVEs for every IoT device that has a default credential that can be reverse engineered from firmware and easily cracked? Because that would be a lot of CVEs in my estimation. But also, like, do you differentiate the ones that are in the documentation the same as the web interface or not? I don't know. I put that on social media today. That was kind of my
What kind of responses have you gotten so far?
Not much response. I was hoping to get more response, but not much. I get better responses when I post ridiculous memes, but you know, it is what it is.
You need AI to generate a ridiculous meme associated with default undocumented admin passwords. Right. And
We'd be issuing a lot of CVEs. Do we need to? So my question to you is, do we need a CVE to document default easily crackable? I guess you have to define easily crackable credentials. So I will say, I'll qualify this. By default, EMBA runs a very basic set, like basic dictionary, John the Ripper based cracking attempts against any password hashes that it finds in an automated fashion. So I didn't do anything like ridiculously innovative or anything even creative.
What was
I basically took the firmware and I ran it through EMBA's default scan profile,
right?
and it came back and it had cracked the password. To me, that should be a bar. Like there should be a bar for that. Like, but also that same credential was in the documentation.
And why run Crack or John the Ripper or whatever if all you had to do was read the documentation?
I think there could be a great. So there already is an LLM tie-in into EMBA. I think it's a great usage of an LLM to say, rather than spend the time, to your point, Jeff, to crack the credential, use an LLM to go find the documentation and find the default credentials in the documentation.
Or if it's an IoT device, I don't know how you would do this, but hire people to go out and take pictures of the label that's printed on, that's stuck on the back of it that prints what the password is, regardless of how complex it is.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about it, because there's also huge default password databases that exist on the internet today as well that have done this. So
and I just thought somebody always publishes the top 10 or 100 most common passwords that they've encountered in the past year.
The great Karnak knows these passwords. Password 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, like admin 1, 2, 3, 4, admin blank password is most IoT devices, but there's a lot of variants out there in terms of usernames and passwords. I suppose you could write a crawler that goes and pulls all the user manuals for all the IoT devices that you can find, and then run it through an LLM that derives the default usernames and passwords and build a list off of that. I don't know how much more accurate or comprehensive that list would be versus what's published already, because you can find GitHub repositories of people who have done this already. So I'm like, are we issuing CVEs? Is this I guess the question is this a vulnerability?
Absolutely.
Is a default credential
it's a vulnerability. Yes.
But is a default credential in the default firmware a vulnerability, or is it only a vulnerability if you find it in the wild? Right? Because what I did is I analyzed the firmware.
Well,
I didn't go on the internet and scan for these devices and try and log in. To me, that's a vulnerability. You didn't change the default password. The default password has to exist in the firmware. Is inclusion of a default credential in the default firmware a vulnerability? If so, we get a lot more CVEs to file.
Man, we could go several different ways here. In the early days, when people were getting their first accounts and their first user IDs on their first networks, it was very common to either have a blank null password,
right,
or have what we used to call a Joe password, where user ID was also the password. The username, J-man, man J, whatever it was also the password, and you were forced to change the password upon initial login. Of course, in the early days, not everybody wanted to get on the network, and they were afraid, and so that was very commonly exploited by people like me that was doing pen testing.
Is the password
20,
the same
30
as
years
the
ago.
username?
Would it be, in your opinion, would it be better to have a null password that has to be set the first time it's used, the system's used, rather than have a default password that's in the documentation that may or may not get changed?
Yeah, it should be something that is set when you set up the system,
right,
or randomly generated when you install the system. I've seen that as well.
Right.
I build the system or deploy the system, and the first time when I run through setup, which only I can run because maybe I have a console on it. It says, great, like I've set up systems like this in the past, right? Where there's no documented default password. It's set. Thanks, Sam.
See you, Sam.
It's set, right? It's set at install time, and it's either random or user generated.
Right.
Is the preferred method.
So, in my opinion, the vulnerability is not that there's a default password that's documented in the manual. It's more of a procedural vulnerability.
You didn't change
where there
it. If you
isn't
didn't change
where
it, yes.
Well, either you didn't change it, or programmatically you weren't forced to change it or set it.
Yes,
initially.
right.
That's where
That's
the
a really good
vulnerability
point,
is.
Jeff.
That's a great point, Jeff. It is.
Yeah.
Yep. If you're not forced to change it, that should be the vulnerability. It doesn't matter what the default credential is.
And I would actually say that is worthy of a CVE if there's technology out there that's not forcing somebody to change or set a password. I think that's a CVE.
A manufacturer CVE, because they caused it by not forcing you to set a proper password after you log in the first time.
But that would mean we'd have
that.
to issue a CVE for Kali Linux.
Okay.
Right? It would, because it comes with a default. It comes by default.
You son of a gun.
But Raspbian, the Raspberry Pi OS, did not do that.
Well, and
right, they used to, and they changed it, much to everyone's chagrin. But it was because so many people who were deploying Raspberry Pi technology because they want to do some cool project, they want to learn computing, which is absolutely fantastic, by the way. But they weren't changing the default credential for the Pi user on Raspberry Pi, so they made it so that.
And that sounds very reminiscent of the early days where, and Microsoft was notorious for this, where everything was turned on by default, so that it was usable when you first plugged it in and turned it on. And it took Microsoft years, or people years, to convince Microsoft you really need to lock things down at the outset and make people turn things on if they need them, rather than have everything on by default.
It's very much like
But even if it's pointing to Kali Linux, I mean, what's sacred about Kali Linux that they can't?
Why can't they
follow some basic best practices?
Why can't they follow suit with Raspberry Pi? When Raspberry Pi made that change, why can't Kali Linux make that change? I don't want to call. I mean, I guess I'm calling out the Kali Linux people.
I'm calling them out right now. I mean, I don't know any of them. I don't think. But
when you install Kali, ask the user what's your initial password. When I install Ubuntu, I just installed Ubuntu this week. In fact, it ties into my other story. I have a Surface laptop here running Windows 10 that sometimes Larry and I have when Larry's in the studio, sometimes we've had some issues. So I've got a graveyard of computing here in the studio.
Yes, you do.
So I cobbled together an awesome, but actually this System 76 system, it's an older Thelio System 76 system. I popped some random graphics card in it that I stole from another system, and it works great. And now that's under the desk here, and it's a backup to the Windows system. When I installed Ubuntu on that system, it said, you got to tell me what your initial account is. Give me a username, give me a password, give me a name for that account, and that's the account. Why can't, and again, Raspbian did the same thing. Why can't Kali do the same thing? Why can't every other vendor on the planet do the same thing? If they don't, it should be a CVE.
And the answer to the question, though, is they don't want to lock people out inadvertently from their own stuff. So
fucking bad.
Part of the process needs to be setting up the recovery procedures. But why not do that? I mean, especially since I don't personally have any Linux devices these days. I apologize. And
you just don't know it.
Well, that's true.
Do you have Android?
Yes.
Do you have Android, Jeff?
Yes.
So you have a Linux device?
Yes. I have a Linux device.
And you can run a full Linux terminal in a virtual machine on your Android device now.
When you're done, pointing out the error of my statement, what I would like to say is I don't commonly I've never used Kali. I don't believe that's the version that's running on my Android.
It is not.
But I hear about Kali all the time. It's like the preferred flavor of Linux or one of the preferred flavors of Linux for, let's just say,
there's a
security
whole-
researchers.
Yeah, there's a stigma about it.
And
sure.
why not enforce good security best practices and
Yeah, I agree.
procedures in the stuff that's being used by the people that are going around becoming pen testers and researchers and whatnot? Now, I know the answer to that is because we all like to have root and do nothing but
Yeah,
on
but set
root.
the ask me for what the root password should be, or the Kali Linux Kali user on Kali should be during install time.
It's kind of like it's bugged me.
Which you can say. There are ways to do that,
Right.
But it is slightly
Yes.
more inconvenient to do that, right? Like you can pre-populate that with a password.
So
you can
stupid-
pre-populate that with an SSH public key,
Right.
right? Put
Right.
this key in authorized keys. There's lots of systems that are like, hey, set a default password, but also like, do you want to upload your public key for SSH? I'll add that to the authorized keys file, and then you'll just have access.
I have a really,
but that's like
really ignorant,
inconvenient, right?
Ignorant
like,
question.
I don't do that because I'm like, I got to go dig up my SSH public key. I got to copy and paste that in there, and then I don't do that. And it's laziness.
Who is? I confess my ignorance, and I apologize. But who's responsible for Kali? Is it a commercial system or is it a freeware system?
Offensive security. Yeah, we interviewed. Well, it was what was his name? It was Mutz for a while, but Mutz retired. And the last I heard,
Did he really retire?
He retired and was like living on a boat somewhere. I don't know, floating around in the. Do we call it the Gulf of Mexico? We call it.
Yes, we call it the Gulf of Mexico. God damn it!
Okay, he was floating around the Gulf of Mexico in a boat, which good for him and his wife. They were fantastic, lovely.
So he retired.
Lovely people.
Yep.
Mutz and Iris and V and Rawjaw and a few others, but that's all the people I knew.
Who runs it? And Jim. We interviewed Jim a couple of years. Was it Jim? What is his handle? We interviewed Jim about offensive security a few years ago. Yeah, but anyway.
So
I got a couple more stories before we in 10 minutes to round it out.
Okay.
Oh, did you see the story I threw in Slack?
To you.
What's up, Josh?
Did you see the story I threw in Slack, Paul?
Oh, I didn't.
It was the Fair Institute is
no, the one above that.
Oh, no.
That's what Sam threw in there. The one about Uncipher.
What is Uncipher in U.S. Intel?
Do you mind if I take it for 2 seconds?
Go for it,
please. Yeah.
So HD Moore actually just put out a LinkedIn announcement about this, which is how I found out about it. And Wim Rems, the Belgian bomber, to his credit, told me about it. But what happened is that there was a company called Unciphered.
I remember that company.
Eric
what did
Michaud.
Unciphered do?
They figured out a way to break into crypto wallets. If you owned a crypto wallet but lost your keys or various configure, I'm not sure specifically how it works.
So you could call Joe Grand or Unciphered. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And they would get it for you. They would open it up for you effectively. What nobody knew, including the NSA veterans that were part of that company, was that the other co-founder was what's his name? Morgan. God, I can't think of
Marquis Bois.
Thank you. I can never pronounce his name properly.
I don't know if I pronounce it
And
correctly.
he is not only an accused rapist, he is also behind a lot of the WikiLeaks stuff or holding onto the WikiLeaks documents.
Oh, interesting.
So the
doesn't surprise me from an NSA perspective at all.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it doesn't surprise you that he was not revealed to the employees.
Doesn't surprise me that they weren't aware.
Oh, okay.
They should have been aware.
They're used to being mushrooms, right?
Yep.
Got it. But they're annoying.
Yeah, because any one or company that can gain access to that type of crypto wallets or that type of thing doesn't surprise me that some government agency from any country does or like has tentacles into that.
Well, no, it's
Right.
not that. It's that they did so these ex-NSA operatives who are working very hard and doing apparently a very good job, working for Eric Michaud, and I can never pronounce his name right, and I apologize, Eric. But
Mm.
they didn't know that they were working for like somebody that could potentially imperil their chance to ever get a clearance again.
Right, right.
Somebody that was accused of rape. I have no idea where that went in the court system, but like it could be a black mark
Well,
on
if
their
you're
record.
accused, you're guilty. Come on.
No,
Well, no.
Stop
In the
no,
public
Jeff,
forum.
Stop.
I'm saying
Sorry, I
allegedly,
watched too much
and I
Law
don't
and
know.
Order.
Yeah, that's okay. It's ding ding, whatever. But the point is that
Don't do that. That's a copyright violation.
I said bing bing, not ding dong or whatever. I don't know. They didn't know, and it could totally affect their ability to ever get a clearance again. That's like not cool.
Yeah, not cool. I've heard of Unciphered before. Yeah,
That's not cool at all. That's dangerous to their employment prospects after they leave or whatever. And they're very, very pissed off. And H.D. Moore was, if I said very uncharitable and extraordinarily blunt about how pissed off he is about that, I think I'd be.
But also for HC to be fired. HC is one of the nicest people you ever want to meet in your entire life.
He's very laid back.
He is genuinely nice person.
Yep.
Oh, he's a sweetheart.
Yep.
Talks a mile
So
a
for him
minute.
to be fired up about something, that's
he is.
pay
His
attention to that.
LinkedIn post was insane.
Yeah.
He's like, if there was anything worse, like he's pissed.
I had a couple more stories to round us out.
Before you jump into that, I just want to make a off.
I'm sorry,
somewhat off tangent comment. We talked several weeks ago about the submission in court to dismiss the summary dismissal, whatever the technical term is, for the Hadnagy suit, where he was suing DEF CON.
I don't know. We've actually talked about that.
We did talk about it on the air, I thought, a couple weeks ago. We just didn't.
No, I think we had it as a story,
but we didn't cover
talk about it. But that is public. Everything about or documents pertaining to that case
were
made public.
Well,
yes.
and there was a submission a month or so ago to have the charges case dismissed, and the whole court record, the whole submission. I'm not sure what the legal term is, but the thing that they put before the judge to say, could you just dismiss this case? The DEF CON did, that had a lot of very detailed, but he did it type of stuff. It was dismissed without prejudice, which means that Hadnagy could refile the charges at some point if he wanted to. But I just noticed that today or yesterday that, I wonder what happened to that. And it has been decided, and it was. So Hadnagy had been suing DEF CON because they had banned him for life, and DEF CON filed a whatever the term is to have the thing dismissed, because they have all this evidence saying, no, he really did all the stuff that we accused him of doing, which is why we banned him for life. That has been dismissed. You can proceed.
So the case is gone now?
The case is gone now, unless Hadnagy wants to refile it.
Oh, that's that's been almost a year.
Well,
over a year.
It's been several years. He was banned. The ban came out in 2020,
24?
No, it was longer than that.
It was longer than that. It
was 21, maybe. That would be my guess. Keep talking, Paul. I know how to find the answer, and I will research it.
Last couple of articles, Paul. Go for it.
Smart Flipper Zero add-ons. This is kind of a soapbox. This is a general soapbox I have. There's a lot of social media accounts that show people like, oh, look at this cool hacking device I have. And they don't give any details about what it is or whatever. So I just want to make some recommendations. If you got a Flipper Zero or thinking about a Flipper Zero, don't spend a lot of money on add-ons. Be smart about what your add-ons are. Consider cheaper alternatives, but also a lot of the add-ons for Flipper Zero are like oh, I've got this whole thing you can plug into your GPIO ports, and it gives you an additional CC1101, which is a chip that provides radio communications on sub-gigahertz frequencies. The Flipper has a CC1101 inside of it already. So the additional one, you just paid more money just for no reason. The ones that I like, my good friend Kevin Finisterre turned me onto this several years ago, and I can't find my original order. But he was like, "Dude, you need an antenna that goes in your GPIO ports that will extend your range for the CC1101 that's in your Flipper Zero." I'm like, "That's great." And there's one I linked to in the show notes for $20. I don't know if that one works as well as the one that I have, and I can't find my original order. I have to ask Kevin like what that original one was, because I can't find it, because I would have put it in the show notes. But an antenna for the one that's in your Flipper is a better investment at $20 for like the add-on boards that are charging like $80 or more for on Tindy or other websites, which is another funny story. I don't know. My wife was looking at the credit card statement and she's like, "Are you on a dating website?" I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "I see this thing like Tindy." I'm like, "I was ordering electronics." And she's like, "That's a dating one." I'm like, "No, that's Tinder, not Tindy. Like, go to the."
I can show you my Tinder account. It's completely different.
It's completely different. No, I'm not on Tinder.
I'm not on Tinder. I'm on Tindy Pro.
Like, "Sweetie, you married a nerd. Okay, I'm ordering electronics." She's like, "That's so boring." It's so not interesting, right?
Would you prefer I was on Tinder?
Right? Yeah, because right. I'm like, no, I'm just a nerd. I order electronics.
Isn't that what gave birth literally to the whole shift left, shift right marketing term?
She's like, "Wait, you order stuff from AliExpress?" I'm like,
Yeah.
"For like a long time, yeah, like all the time." She's like, I want to order stuff from there too." I'm like, "You can use my," I'm like, "Here's my phone. You can use my account." Right? And she orders stuff. And then she's like, "Well, this DH gate is so much better for ordering clothing." I'm like, "Yeah, don't order clothing from AliExpress," because I haven't had great luck ordering clothing from electronics. Lighters. This lighter I have right here came from AliExpress. $5. It's awesome. It
That's
looks like
$5.
This was $5, Jeff. Like, follow
Light it
me
up.
for
Light it up. Light it up.
Oh, dude, it is like,
ooh, that's not going through TSA, but I would use it at home.
No. Don't try and take that through TSA. Anyway,
2022,
So-
February 2022 was when Hadnegi was
22.
banned.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So like 3 years ago.
You know,
I
seriously,
spend a lot of time thinking about why people hate firmware updates, and Samsung with their sound bar is one reason why people fear firmware updates. There was a Samsung firmware update for the sound bar that bricked people's sound bars. It bricked them.
universally.
And like, so in my day job, I'm like, the remediation is almost always update your firmware. And I'm like, why don't people want to apply those? Because of instances like this, where you have a Samsung soundbar, which is working great, and it takes a firmware update and then it's bricked. And so that was one of my stories too.
I actually bricked
Do you
an
have a
entire casino
Samsung?
once.
Does anyone have a Samsung soundbar?
No, but I did an
No.
update on a casino and bricked an entire casino once.
Oh my God, dude. But like, and so people are like, what do I do? So I went to the Samsung forum that was linked in this article, and people are like really pissed. I'm like, I don't blame you for being pissed. And they're like, my soundbar is bricked. And I'm like, well, if you had a spy programmer and like, the original firm, like you could revert, but most people don't. And I get that. And so they're like, I had to send my soundbar back to Samsung, where Samsung does the spy flash programmer, like recovers the device. Or what I read was they just replaced the main board. So like, it's easier for the manufacturer to go, we're just going to replace the board on the device rather than like recover the spy flash. I'm like, that's telling.
Yeah.
And so they replace the main board, right? The motherboard or the PCB that holds all the chips that powers the device, right? They're just going to replace that and then ship it back to you. And I'm like, that's it's exactly why we are, as in like a community, really, really adverse to updating firmware, because when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. That's one of my notes, right? When it goes wrong, it's really wrong. My last one was it was I really want to put together like a webinar or presentation where I talk about, like, the title for me is the Linux desktop for security professionals. I want to refine that a little bit to the Linux desktop for skeptical security professionals. Like I know Linux, I've dabbled with Linux, I've tried to use it.
That implies that there's security professionals that aren't skeptical, and I would argue, then why are they?
It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress, Jeff, right? But like, I feel like there's I'm not going to convince everyone. I know that, right? But I feel like there's this subsection.
You're appealing to the DEF CON crowd, not the Black Hat crowd.
I'm appealing to the crowd that's open to it, that like there's a percentage of the audience that I'm like, I'm never going to convince. There's a percentage of the audience that are with me. They're like, yeah, I'm good. But there's this like kind of middle ground that hasn't quite made the decision yet. And they're basing the decision on this?
Independence.
3 to 5. But 3 to 5 years ago, I tried Linux and it didn't work crowd. And what I'm telling you is that 3 to 5 years later, it's a much better place. And with Windows 10 being end of
support,
end of life,
end of
support,
end of security patches, October 2025,
end of support
is when Microsoft's like, look, you're not going to get any more security updates for Windows 10. And by the way,
raise your hand if you're still running Windows 10.
Yeah,
I
am
have
too.
A desktop.
Me too. My Surface Pro here in the studio is Windows 10. It supports Windows 11, so I will, before October 25, take it to Windows 11, because I keep one Windows device here in the studio and one at home. My one at home already runs Windows 10. It's one of those little mini PCs with the screen, a touch screen on it, and it's great. And like, I keep it as a backup. I keep it for like the rare case where I need Windows, right?
Yeah.
It runs great. And
I'll tell you what.
As a Linux zealot, I'm like, it's fine. I'll keep couple of Windows. I have two, one at home, one here, right? But my point is, I think I can convince, for no other reason than like, I want to, like, the mountain's there, so I want to climb it. Like, I think there's this middle ground of people that are like, shit, Windows 10 is end of life. I don't have a device that supports a TPM 2.0 in secure boot, which Windows 11 requires. But I still want to keep my older PC. This is another like feather in my cap as a Linux zealot that like you should run Linux.
Okay, Paul, I'll make you a deal. I have a desktop literally sitting 3 feet to my left. It was my primary desktop that is not upgradable. Exactly the TPM 2.0, which you're talking about.
Yes.
I will, if you design what is an appropriate Linux desktop for a security
tell me what software you want to run. Sure. And I'll come up with the Linux alternatives to that in the right distro. You get to pick the right distro. It's a personal choice. Sure.
Given that the Microsoft suite is all cloud, virtual cloud-based these days.
Well, that's one of my arguments.
Google Cloud, Google Docs. Yes. I mean,
that's one of the innovate. Like, if I edit a Google Doc, like, so let's talk about this. Is a great, Jeff. You bring up a great area of, I need to edit presentations and documents, right? Either you're doing that in Google Cloud or G Suite, or you're doing that in
whatever Microsoft calls it this week.
Calls it these days in 365. I don't usually need to edit local Microsoft formatted files, but if I do, there's a great project called Only Office that I use on all my Linux systems, where my boss just the other day was like, oh, I got a PowerPoint presentation. She's like, can you read that and edit that? I'm like, yes, no problem. It's called Only Office. I use it all the time. It's great.
Okay, I'll make a deal. I have this box that I need to, I'd love to turn into an actual workstation again, because running my Mac laptop, because I bought a Mac to replace it, back and forth is kind of a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
I live in Google Docs and the Google Suite and Chrome.
You're good, dude.
And I
You're
live
good,
in M365 and Teams.
Teams works totally fine in a browser.
OneDrive.
I have meetings with external clients that are like, it's a Teams meeting.
And I live in text editors for everything, just about everything else. I'm in text editors.
Totally fine.
Okay.
There are rare exceptions I find where you absolutely like 100% need Linux.
So I can do everything I do and be running on a Linux box, and I could go back to Linux after all these years.
All right, tell me which programs and tell me which distro I will install.
I'm not going to do Kali Linux because they don't force a password change.
I think I have a lot of the, like, if you need to, like, what is the webinar software? GoToMeeting.
GoToMeeting.
If you need to be a presenter at GoToMeeting, you got to be Windows. If you need to run this weird room,
but who uses GoToMeeting
audio server, audio client that I use, you got to be Windows.
Skype is on. What about Zoom?
It's like an audio.
Zoom.
It's like a stupid audio file thing. If you need to run, what is the forensic toolkit? There's some forensic toolkit thing. What is it called? No, there's another open source
sleuth
forensic
autopsy.
I think it's autopsy that my good friend Dave Manor was like, dude, you can run it on Linux, but don't. You need Windows
Riverside?
To run it. And I was like, dude, you're wrong. I'm going to run it on Linux. I tried to run it on Linux. I'm like, holy shit, that was a shit show. I need to run it on Windows. So there's like 3 things in the past 3 to 5 years that I'm like,
flavor of Linux. Go.
So my flavor of Linux, I like Manjaro in terms of like newer software, making a good repository available. My other systems I run Ubuntu on to drive here in the studio. So those are my 2.
Is there a flavor of Linux that would be a pitch for a corporate enterprise shift to Linux?
I would say Ubuntu would probably mostly where I go. Like if I look at our engineering team at Eclipsium, for example, Jeff, in terms of playing nice with corporate stuff, Ubuntu is definitely up there.
Okay. I mean, I got to do something by October. My corporate laptop is still Windows 10, but everything I do pretty much is virtual.
I want to put myself out there. It's
based on Arch,
like a conference presentation or webinar where I'm like, Linux desktop for the security professional. You can throw things at me. It's totally fine. But I'm saying try it again. And me personally, I'll feel better. Like I'll feel good if I can.
Does Ubuntu have a patch
small
Tuesday?
Percentage of people to come to Linux versus going to like the Apple environment or Microsoft.
Somewhat tongue in cheek, but somewhat serious. But does Ubuntu have regular updates, patch cycle? Do they have a patch Tuesday?
Oh yeah. Not a patch Tuesday. It's a regular release cycle, and I have a new utility I talked about a couple of weeks ago called Top Grade that is absolutely amazing for keeping your systems up to date. Amazing. I've implemented it on all my systems actually in the past couple of weeks, and I couldn't be happier because it's not just the regular updates, but updates for all the fringe things, Snap, Flatpak.
You're not the one to make happy. I'm the one to make happy.
And I will download Manjaro and I will try to install it on this workstation. And when I start cursing, I'll just call you. Okay.
You call me, Josh. I'll help you through it. I can't promise that for everyone, but for my friends,
look, I've gotten through Pen 2 and Gen 2 and things like that. I actually can compile things. I
have that laptop that you bought me when you broke mine. I might try putting Ubuntu on. I still have it. And it's slow as shit. I never use it, but
I'm telling you,
I could revitalize it with Ubuntu.
All the systems in here I put Ubuntu on that are very much older Intel NUC. Intel doesn't make NUCs anymore, right?
They don't?
No. Intel got out of the NUC business, and B-Link is the company that people have gravitated to, but I put it on the Riverside that's putting me on this podcast right now is an older Intel NUC running Ubuntu.
All right. Yeah. So we should wrap down with Kali, up with Ubuntu. We should probably wrap it up, Paul.
No, don't run Kali as your desktop, but have Kali for other things. That's again, I'll cover that in my presentation.
Okay.
If you want me to speak at your conference, invite me. now I just tell
And
my wife, like,
pay
look,
is
I have to go to this conference to tell people to use Linux because it is my life mission. And I'm excited about it.
zealot.
Sell it. Yeah. No, install the third-party drivers. Okay, that's the other thing. Don't try and go all like open source. I don't want any. No. One of the reasons I have a better experience with Linux is I'm like, yes, third-party proprietary stuff. Install that, enhance my experience. I don't care if it's proprietary. Anyway, that will conclude this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Over and out.